baby hadn't blinked in 3 months. Not once, not when the light hit his face, not when loud sounds filled the room, not even when his father held him close and begged for just one small sign that his son knew he existed. The doctors had called it permanent. The specialists had walked away shaking their heads, and Robert Sullivan, one of the richest men in Dallas, Texas, had locked himself and his infant son inside their mansion, convinced that hope was gone forever. But what nobody knew yet was that everything they believed was wrong. Robert's wife died when their private jet crashed into a mountain during a storm. She was 7 months pregnant. The doctors managed to save the baby through emergency surgery, but the child came out silent. His eyes didn't follow movement. They didn't react to bright lights or shifting shadows. A team of eye specialists examined him for weeks. Every test came back the same. The nerves weren't responding. The boy was blind from birth, they said. There was nothing anyone could do. Robert named him Tyler. He held him every single day, trying to find some connection, some flicker of recognition, but Tyler just lay there, quiet and still. His tiny face showed no emotion. His eyes stared at nothing. It was like holding a doll that breathed but never woke up. Robert stopped going to work. He stopped answering calls from his company. He fired all the staff except for one cook and one housekeeper who only came twice a week. He wanted to take care of Tyler himself. No nurses, no nannies, just him and his son. Hey everyone, thanks for stopping by. Comment where you're watching from. Someone near you might be watching too. Hit like, share, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story. Watch till the very end. The final twist will blow your mind. Let's jump right in. Every morning, Robert carried Tyler to the big window in the living room. He opened the curtains wide, letting the Texas sun pour in. He talked to Tyler about everything, about his mother, about the plans they had, about how much he wished things were different, but Tyler never responded. His head would tilt slightly to one side, but his expression stayed empty. Robert tried music, soft lullabies, jazz, classical pieces. Nothing changed. He bought toys that made sounds, lights that flashed different colors, mobiles that spun above the crib. Tyler never reached for any of them. The mansion felt like a tomb. Every footstep echoed. Every door that closed sounded too loud. The baby monitor was always silent. No crying, no cooing, just breathing. Robert walked through empty rooms filled with things that would never be used. A playroom with shelves full of toys. A nursery painted with bright murals of animals and trees. It all felt like a cruel reminder of what should have been. Some nights Robert sat in the dark holding Tyler, wondering if his son could even feel his warmth. Did Tyler know when someone held him? Did he feel safe or scared? Was he aware of anything at all? The questions never stopped, and the silence never broke. Robert spoke to his wife's photo every night, asking her what he was supposed to do. He watched old videos of her laughing, planning the nursery, picking out baby clothes. That version of life felt like it belonged to someone else now. Months passed like this. The same routine: wake up, feed Tyler, change him, try to play, nothing, try again, still nothing, bath time, bedtime, silence. Robert's chest felt heavy all the time, like something was pressing down on him that he couldn't move. He was drowning in grief and helplessness, and there was no way out. One afternoon, Robert sat on the floor next to Tyler's mat, just staring at him. The boy was 6 months old now, but he still hadn't smiled, hadn't laughed, hadn't made a single sound beyond breathing. Robert leaned his head back against the couch and closed his eyes. He felt like he was failing, not just as a father, but as a person. He had all the money in the world, but he couldn't fix this. He couldn't reach his own son. That night, Robert made a decision. He couldn't do this alone anymore. He needed help, not medical help. He'd tried that. He needed someone to share the weight, someone to help keep the house running while he focused on Tyler. So he called an agency and asked them to send someone reliable, someone quiet, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. 3 days later, a woman named Grace arrived at the front gate. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled into a simple ponytail. She carried one small bag and wore plain clothes. No makeup, no jewelry, just tired eyes and a polite but distant expression. The housekeeper let her in and gave her a quick tour. Grace didn't talk much. She nodded at the right times and asked only practical questions. Where do the cleaning supplies go? What time does Mr. Sullivan wake up? When should meals be ready? The housekeeper showed her the rooms she'd be responsible for, the kitchen, the hallways, the guest bathrooms. Then they walked past the nursery. Grace glanced inside and saw the crib, the toys, the colorful walls, but there was no baby in sight. She didn't ask about it. It wasn't her business. She was here to work, not to get involved in someone else's life. Grace had her own reasons for taking this job. A few months earlier, she had lost her baby. He was only 3 weeks old when he stopped breathing in the middle of the night. The doctors called it unexplained infant death. No warning, no cause. One moment he was alive and the next he was gone. Grace's world collapsed after that. She couldn't stay in her apartment, couldn't go back to her old job at the diner, couldn't face the people who kept saying they were sorry. She needed to disappear. When she saw the job listing for a live-in housekeeper in a private home outside the city, she applied immediately. She didn't care where it was or who lived there. She just needed somewhere new, somewhere she could work and stay busy and not think about what she had lost. Now, standing in this huge, silent mansion, she felt like she'd made the right choice. It was quiet here, empty, no one would bother her. She could do her job and keep her head down. That first night, Grace unpacked her things in the small room they gave her upstairs. A bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over the backyard. It was enough. She didn't need much. She lay down and stared at the ceiling, trying not to think about the crib she used to have in her old apartment, trying not to remember the smell of baby soap or the way her son's tiny fingers used to wrap around hers. The next morning, Grace started her routine. She cleaned the kitchen, wiped down the counters, and swept the floors. She moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb anyone. Around noon, she heard footsteps upstairs. A man's voice, soft and low, talking to someone. She kept working, pretending not to notice. Later, she saw him for the first time. Robert Sullivan, tall, mid-30s, wearing a wrinkled shirt and sweatpants. He was holding a baby in his arms, rocking him gently while standing near the window. Grace stopped in the hallway, unsure if she should pass by or wait. Robert glanced over and gave her a tired nod. She nodded back and kept walking, but as she turned the corner, she looked back once more. The baby in his arms wasn't moving. His head rested limply against Robert's shoulder. His eyes were open, but they weren't looking at anything. Grace felt something tighten in her chest. She recognized that look. Over the next few days, Grace kept her distance. She cleaned in the mornings and stayed out of the way in the afternoons, but she started noticing things. The baby was always silent, always still. She never heard him cry or babble, and whenever she walked past, he never turned his head toward the sound of her footsteps. One afternoon, she found Robert sitting on the couch with the baby lying across his lap. He was holding a toy in front of the boy's face, shaking it gently, trying to get some kind of reaction. Nothing happened. Grace watched from the doorway. She didn't mean to stare, but she couldn't look away. The baby's eyes were wide open, but they didn't track the toy. They didn't blink. They just stayed fixed on nothing. Robert put the toy down and sighed, running a hand through his hair. Grace stepped back quietly and returned to the kitchen, but that image stayed with her. That baby wasn't just quiet. He was somewhere else, locked inside himself. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Tyler, about the way he just lay there, unresponsive. It reminded her too much of her own son during those final hours. The stillness, the silence, the feeling that something was deeply, horribly wrong. She sat up in bed and pressed her hands to her face, trying to push the memories away, but they wouldn't leave. The next morning, Grace was assigned to help with some light cleaning in the living room. When she walked in, Tyler was lying on a soft mat on the floor, surrounded by toys. Grace set down her basket and started dusting the shelves, but her eyes kept drifting to the baby. He hadn't moved in 10 minutes, not even a twitch. His hands were resting by his sides, fingers slightly curled. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead. Grace crouched down slowly, watching him. She didn't touch him, she just observed. His chest rose and fell steadily. He was breathing fine, but there was no curiosity in his face, no awareness. Most Barbies his age would reach for things, turn their heads toward sounds, or at least fidget. Tyler did none of that. The housekeeper walked by and noticed Grace staring. "That's Tyler," she said flatly. "Mr. Sullivan's son. Poor thing was born blind, doesn't respond to anything." Grace nodded without saying a word. The housekeeper left. Grace stayed where she was for a moment longer, then slowly stood up and went back to her work. But something inside her had shifted. She couldn't explain it. She didn't want to care. She came here to avoid getting attached to anything, but that baby pulled at something deep in her chest, something she thought she had buried. Over the next week, Grace kept working, but she found herself thinking about Tyler constantly. She noticed small things, like how the staff would bring a bottle of eye drops every afternoon and put them in Tyler's eyes, or how Robert would sit for hours just holding him, talking to him, even though the baby never responded. She noticed how the house felt heavy with sadness, how every room seemed too big and too empty. One morning, Grace was asked to help bathe Tyler. Robert had been doing it himself every day, but he had an important phone call that couldn't wait. Grace hesitated. She hadn't held a baby since her own son died, but she nodded and agreed. Robert brought Tyler to the dining room where a small plastic tub had been set up on the table. He handed the baby to Grace carefully, giving her quick instructions. Just support his head. The water's already warm. There's soap and a sponge right there. Grace took Tyler into her arms. He felt light, too light. His body was limp and his head tilted to one side. She carried him over to the tub and slowly lowered him into the water. Tyler didn't react, no flinch, no sound. Grace picked up the sponge and began washing his arms gently. She moved carefully, almost mechanically, trying not to feel anything, but it was impossible. Holding this baby brought everything back. The weight, the warmth, the awful, aching absence of her own child. She dipped the sponge in the soapy water and moved it across Tyler's chest. Bubbles formed around his skin. She wiped his shoulders, then moved toward his face. That's when it happened. A small drop of soapy water slid down his forehead and touched the corner of his eye. Tyler blinked. Grace froze. Her hand stopped in midair. She stared at his face. Did that just happen? She waited, barely breathing. Then she wiped his forehead again, letting another drop roll near his other eye. Tyler blinked again, and then he made a sound, a soft hum, almost like a sigh. Grace's heart started pounding. She leaned closer, watching him carefully. His mouth moved slightly, lips parting just a little. Then quietly he made another sound, MMM. It was faint, but it was there. Grace's hands trembled. She didn't know what to do. Should she call Robert? Was this normal? She kept staring at Tyler's face, searching for more signs. Then something even stranger happened. Tyler's eyes shifted, not a lot, just a tiny movement to the left, like he was trying to look at something. Grace slowly moved her hand to the side. Tyler's eyes followed. She moved it to the right. His eyes tracked the motion. Grace gasped. Her pulse raced. This wasn't random. This was real. Tyler was reacting. He was seeing something. She finished the bath quickly, her mind spinning. She dried him off with a towel and dressed him in clean clothes, her hands shaking the entire time. When Robert came back into the room, Grace was sitting in a chair, holding Tyler against her chest. "Everything okay?" Robert asked. Grace looked up at him, unsure how to explain what had just happened. "He blinked," she said quietly. Robert frowned. "What?" When the water touched his face, he blinked, and he made a sound. Robert stared at her, then at Tyler. "He blinks sometimes," Robert said slowly. "It's just a reflex." "No," Grace said, her voice stronger now. "It wasn't random. He did it twice. And his eyes moved. He followed my hand." Robert's expression changed. He stepped closer, looking down at his son. "Are you sure?" Grace nodded. "I'm sure." For the first time in months, something flickered in Robert's eyes. Not quite hope, but something close to it. The next morning, Grace asked if she could bathe Tyler again. Robert agreed. Watching from a few feet away this time, Grace repeated everything exactly as she had done before. She filled the tub with warm water, added soap, and gently placed Tyler inside. She washed his arms, his chest, then moved toward his face. When the soapy water touched his skin, Tyler blinked. Then he made that same soft sound, MMM. Robert stepped closer, his eyes wide. Grace moved her hands slowly in front of Tyler's face. The baby's eyes followed, left, right, up slightly. Robert's breath caught. "He's tracking," he whispered. Grace nodded. "He's been doing this since yesterday." Robert crouched down next to the tub, staring at his son like he was seeing him for the first time. "Tyler," he said softly. The baby didn't respond with words, but his eyes shifted toward the sound of Robert's voice. Grace wiped Tyler's forehead again, and this time the baby smiled. It was small and brief, but it was real. Robert's eyes filled with tears. He reached out and touched Tyler's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled slightly around his father's thumb. Robert let out a shaky breath and covered his mouth with his other hand, trying not to break down. Grace stayed quiet, giving him the moment. She could see the weight lifting off his shoulders, the grief cracking just a little. After the bath, Robert sat with Tyler for a long time, just holding him and talking to him. Grace cleaned up the tub and put everything away, but she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen. This baby wasn't blind, or at least not completely. Something else was going on. That night, Grace lay in bed replaying everything in her mind, the blink, the sound, the way Tyler's eyes had followed her hand. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a pattern, and patterns meant something. The next day, Grace started paying closer attention to Tyler's routine. She noticed that every afternoon someone would bring a small bottle and put drops in his eyes. She'd seen it happen before but never thought much about it. Now she was curious. When everyone left the room, Grace picked up the bottle and looked at the label. The print was faded and hard to read. She squinted, trying to make out the words. The expiration date was smudged, but she could see enough to know it was old. Very old. Grace turned the bottle over in her hands. Why would they still be using expired medicine? She put it back carefully and didn't say anything. Not yet, but the thought stayed with her. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Grace pulled out her phone and tried to search for the medicine. The label was too worn to read fully, but she managed to make out part of the name. After scrolling through medical websites for almost an hour, she finally found a match. The medication was used to reduce sensitivity to light in patients with certain eye conditions, but it wasn't meant for infants, and the side effects included blurred vision, delayed pupil response, and reduced ability to detect brightness. Grace's stomach dropped. She read the description again just to be sure. Then she sat back against her pillow, staring at the screen. If Tyler had been getting these drops every day since birth, it could explain everything. His lack of response. His stillness, his seeming blindness. What if he wasn't blind at all? What if the medicine was making it worse? Grace didn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about the drops, about Tyler's reactions during the bath, about how his eyes had followed her hand. The pieces were starting to fit together, but she didn't know what to do with the information. She was just the housekeeper. Who would believe her? The next morning, Grace watched carefully as the staff came in to give Tyler his eye drops. She said nothing, but after they left, she noticed something. Tyler seemed slower after the drops, more distant. His eyes went back to that blank stare. By the next morning, though, before the next dose, he seemed slightly more alert again. Grace tested it again during the bath. This time, Tyler blinked faster. He made more sounds. He even reached out toward the water with one hand. Robert noticed too. He's doing it again, he said, amazed. Grace nodded, but inside she was putting it all together. The timing, the reactions, the medicine. She needed to tell Robert. But how? What if she was wrong? What if she made things worse? That night, Grace paced her room, trying to figure out what to say. Finally, she decided she had to speak up. Tyler deserved that much, even if it made her uncomfortable, even if it wasn't her place. The next evening, Grace knocked on Robert's office door. He opened it, looking tired but not annoyed. Grace, is everything okay? She took a deep breath. I need to talk to you about Tyler. Robert's expression shifted. He stepped aside and let her in. Grace sat down on the edge of a chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Then she told him everything, the blinks, the sounds, the way Tyler's eyes followed movement, and then she told him about the medicine. Robert listened without interrupting. His face went from curious to confused to angry. When she finished, he stood up and walked to his desk. He pulled open a drawer and started rifling through papers. The drops were prescribed by his doctor, Robert said. A specialist. I trusted him completely. Do you still have the prescription? Grace asked. Robert found a folder and handed it to her. Grace opened it and looked at the paperwork. The doctor's name was printed at the top. Dr. Lawrence Bishop. Grace pulled out her phone and typed the name into the search bar. It took a few seconds, but the results came up quickly. Her face went pale. What? Robert asked, stepping closer. Grace turned the screen toward him. The headline read, Doctor's license revoked after multiple cases of medical misconduct. Robert grabbed the phone and read the article. His hands started shaking. Dr. Bishop had been investigated for prescribing unnecessary or harmful treatments to infants. His license was taken away 8 months ago. Robert sat down heavily, staring at the screen. I had no idea, he whispered. I never checked, I just trusted him. Grace didn't say anything. She let him process it. After a long silence, Robert stood up and grabbed the bottle of eye drops from a shelf. He looked at the label, then at Grace. We stop these. Right now, no more drops. Grace nodded. I think that's the right choice. Robert walked to Tyler's room. The baby was asleep in his crib, breathing softly. Robert stood over him, looking down at his son with tears in his eyes. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I didn't know. I should have asked more questions. I should have looked closer. Grace stood in the doorway, watching quietly. She could feel the weight of his guilt, but she also saw something else. Determination. Robert wasn't going to let this continue. He was going to fight for his son. The next morning, Robert called a new doctor. Someone with no connection to Dr. Bishop. A woman named Dr. Carter came to the house that same day. She was kind and thorough. She spent over an hour examining Tyler, testing his responses to light, sound, and movement. Grace stayed nearby the entire time, watching closely. When Dr. Carter finished, she sat down with Robert and Grace and explained her findings. Tyler has partial vision, she said. He's not completely blind. The drops he was receiving likely suppressed his visual response. It's hard to say if there's been any permanent damage, but with proper therapy and stimulation, he should continue to improve. Robert's eyes filled with tears. He looked at Grace. You were right. Grace didn't smile, she just nodded. What do we do now? Robert asked the doctor. Dr. Carter gave them a plan: light therapy, visual stimulation. No more drops, and time. It won't happen overnight, she said, but Tyler has a chance. Over the next few weeks, Grace and Robert worked together to help Tyler. They opened all the curtains every morning, letting sunlight fill the house. They played with colorful toys, moving them slowly so Tyler could track them. They used mirrors, flashlights, and bright shapes. And every day Tyler responded a little more. He blinked faster. He smiled more often. He reached for things. He made sounds, real sounds, not just hums, but babbles that sounded almost like words. Robert started laughing again. For the first time in months, the house felt alive. Grace watched it all unfold, feeling both joy and pain. She was happy for Tyler, but every time she held him, she thought about her own son, the one she couldn't save. One afternoon, Tyler was sitting on the floor playing with a red ball. He looked up at Grace and reached out his arms. "Mama," he said. The word was messy and broken, but it was there. Grace froze, her breath caught. Tyler said it again. "Mama." Robert, who was standing nearby, stopped what he was doing and looked over. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She picked Tyler up and held him close, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. "I'm not your mama," she whispered, but Tyler just snuggled into her shoulder, content. Robert walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. "You saved him," he said quietly. "You're the only one who saw the truth." Grace shook her head. "I just paid attention." "That's more than anyone else did," Robert said, "including me." Grace looked down at Tyler, who was now playing with the collar of her shirt. She realized something in that moment. She hadn't just helped Tyler see, he had helped her heal. By caring for him, by noticing him, by refusing to give up, she had found a reason to keep going. Months later, Robert decided to take legal action against Dr. Bishop and the pharmaceutical company that made the drops. Grace agreed to testify. She told her story in court, explaining everything she had noticed. The blinks, the sounds, the timing. Her testimony was powerful. The case gained national attention. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines read, "Housekeeper discovers baby isn't blind. Medical misconduct exposed by everyday hero." Grace didn't want the attention. She declined interviews and avoided cameras, but people kept calling her a hero. Letters arrived at the house from other parents who had been through similar situations. Some thanked her, others asked for advice. Grace read every letter, but she never responded. She didn't feel like a hero. She just felt like someone who had done what needed to be done. The court ruled in Robert's favor. Dr. Bishop was fined heavily, and new regulations were put in place to monitor infant prescriptions more closely. Tyler's medical records were corrected. His diagnosis was changed. He was no longer listed as blind, just visually impaired, with a strong chance of continued improvement. Robert framed a photo of Tyler holding a toy and smiling. He hung it in his office. Every time he looked at it, he remembered how close he had come to losing his son completely, not to death, but to silence. Tyler continued to grow. He started crawling faster. He recognized faces. He laughed when Grace made funny sounds. He clapped when music played. The boy who had once sat in silence was now full of life. Grace stayed on as part of the household, not as a housekeeper anymore, but as part of the family. Robert didn't ask her to leave. She didn't want to. One evening, as the sun set over the backyard, Grace sat on the porch with Tyler in her lap. He was looking up at the sky, pointing at the clouds. "Bird," he said, even though there was no bird. Grace smiled. "Close enough, buddy." Robert stepped outside and sat down beside them. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come here?" he asked. Grace looked at Tyler, then at Robert. "Every day," she said, "but I did come here, and that's what matters." Robert nodded. "You gave him a life. You gave us both a life." Grace didn't say anything. She just held Tyler a little closer and watched the sunset. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, not because of fate or destiny, but because she had chosen to see, she had chosen to care, and that choice had changed everything. Tyler grew into a happy, curious child. He never fully regained perfect vision, but he saw enough. Enough to run, enough to play, enough to look his father in the eyes and say, "I love you." And every time he did, Robert thought about Grace, the woman who had walked into their lives carrying her own grief and had somehow found the strength to notice what no one else could. Years later, when Tyler was old enough to understand, Robert told him the story about the drops, about the doctor, about the woman who had saved him. Tyler listened carefully. Then he asked, "Where is she now?" Robert smiled. "She's in the kitchen making lunch. Want to go help her?" Tyler nodded and ran off. Robert stayed behind for a moment, looking at that same framed photo of his son smiling. He whispered to himself, "Thank you, Grace." And somewhere in the house, Grace heard Tyler's footsteps running toward her. She smiled, ready to catch him, ready to see him, because that's what she did best. She saw people, really saw them. And in a world where so many walked around blind, that was the most powerful gift of all. Dear friends, what you just saw is only a piece of the bigger story. In the next video, a twist no one saw coming will be revealed. Make sure you're here for it. I'd love to hear what you would have done in this situation. Drop your thoughts below. I read every single comment. Thanks so much for watching. Show some love by liking, subscribing, and sharing this with someone who needs to see it.